also like to say the more bodies you come into contact with, the more you learn about different types of bodies and see different types of bodies, and you can, you know, get better at, you know, working out different types of bodies. So people have been shamed because of the way they've been socialized, the way they've learned, and honestly, especially working in the South, a lot of it comes from religion. I see a lot of people with a lot of religious trauma.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and find some ways to explore some very diverse erotic quandaries. Today on The Erotic Philosopher, we have a real treat for you. Marla Renee Stewart, a sexologist and sex coach who runs her own sexuality education company, Velvet Lips, and is also a co-founder of the Sextown South Conference. She's studied human sexuality for more than 19 years and has given over 400 workshops all over the world. She's also been featured on a variety of media outlets, including Netflix's Trigger Warning with Killer Mike and Love and Hip Hop Atlanta. She co-wrote her first book, The Ultimate Guide to Seduction and Foreplay, with Dr. Jessica O'Reilly, which debuted in April of 2020. Enjoy this rich deep dive with Marla Renee Stewart. So Marla, thank you so much for taking some time out of your week to come and talk to us here at The Erotic Philosopher. I really, really appreciate that. And I have followed your work, from a distance for quite some time. And I understand that you do a bazillion things. So for people who perhaps are not entirely familiar with you and your work, how would you describe yourself in your own words?
So I am well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm happy to be here. I do a lot of things. So I am a sexologist, a sex coach, educator. I would definitely call myself a pleasure activist and a sexual strategist. Help people with seduction techniques, helping them with building their sexual confidence, helping them around communication, enhancing their sex skills through my Velvet Lips brand, which is doing workshops as well as private coaching, group workshops, things like that. I also co-founded the Sextown South Conference, and that is a conference that's here in Atlanta. It takes place every year, except of course this year we went virtual. Right. And that's a 3-day conference where it's all sex and sexuality workshops. So educators from around the globe come to Atlanta and teach, and we have enthusiasts is what we call our attendees, and we have a good time there. We have a healing room, we have a dungeon, we have vendors, and it really is absolutely phenomenal. It's a good time. So it's educational and it's fun. We also make sure we have fun at night too.
Yeah, right.
I also teach at a university, so I teach 2 classes a semester. So I've been working for them for 6 years. So I'm in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies there, teaching sociology and women's and gender studies. Coach, give people advice on what to do in their relationships, or how to bring awareness when they're single and want to learn more about their bodies and what their bodies do.
And have you noticed, especially with the conference, having people coming from all over the world, have you noticed things that are kind of unique to particular cultural groups or particular social groups or particular nationalities around, sex stuff, I guess, in particular, that there are things that are really markedly different or things that are really the same?
Well, this conference is really kind of interesting because, when we first began, it was sort of like, it was just sort of like a hodgepodge of people. But what I realize is that even though it seems like a hodgepodge of people, it's invariably mostly people who are sex positive and who are wanting to learn more or get educated more around sex and sexuality. So that is what everybody tends to have in common. Now, we have lots of different sub-communities and subgroups and lots of different, communities that we belong to multiply. But what's really special about the Sextown South Conference is that we prioritize traditionally marginalized voices. So folks of color, queer, trans, non-binary folks, disabled folks, sex workers, survivors, You know, the folks who have been pushed in the margins, kinksters, polyamorous, like the folks who don't normally have these spaces to talk about healthy sexuality and what that looks like in their particular communities. So we find that people come here, get education, and bring it back to their communities so that they can share and put on events or navigate whatever their sexual life in a better way, really, in a more enhanced way.
Right. And I can absolutely see the value in having these sort of public access forums and spaces and conferences for people to come and share knowledge and information and ideas. And it's a relative, conferences obviously have been around a long time, but something to the scale of Sextown South, and something where your real emphasis is on including very diverse voices and sharing skills. When you first started Sextown South, what was the reaction of the broader Atlanta community and also your communities as well to do something like this?
Well, in Atlanta, I think it was very, very particular, and so we had a lot of articles reach out to us and write on us because it was something that has never been done in Atlanta with this, as far as like explicitly talking about sex in all of these different realms. Like we've had like reproductive justice organizations who have had conferences, but as far as like sex and the explicitness of it, we haven't had anything like it. Now we've had there's Frolicon here in Atlanta, which is like the biggest kink conference I think in the nation, but that's mostly playtime, right? So less education but more play. And so we really wanted to focus on the educational aspect. But as far as the broader Atlanta community, it has expanded horizons around sex and sexuality, because last year, Jet Setting Jasmine, King Noir, and I were doing a dungeon tour around the nation. And so, of course, we had in Atlanta for Sextown South, and there were a lot of, particularly black folks, who thought that when Candy Burris, who is, the Real Housewives of Atlanta, when she did her dungeon tour, which was basically like a concert of singers in kinkster outfits, was like, ooh, dungeon tour. They thought that was what a dungeon was. And so until they came to Sextown South, they're like, oh, wow, this is a dungeon. Like, this is a for real dungeon. It was interesting for a lot of them to see that it was primarily people of color, right? So we have, in the dungeon, there were probably 75 to 85%, folks of color, and particularly black folks who occupied the space. So it was interesting for some of the Atlanta community who were like, oh, a dungeon, but not realizing like this is an actual dungeon, not a play, quote unquote, on dungeon, or I don't want to say not like appropriation, but maybe acculturating kinkster attire, which we know has been happening since 70s, 80s, 90s, but more so now after 50 Shades of Grey, people are being a little bit more aware of underground subcultures or different kinds of communities, sexual communities.
Yeah, good. And I think it's so crucial, and the fact that you're really sort of building up so much, so much power with it, and power to it, really helps us sort of destigmatize the taboo of talking about sex out loud and sort of talking about it as something that really matters and matters to people for a lot of reasons. So if I were to say to you, Marla, why do you think sex matters? What would you say?
Oh, I believe sex matters because sex it influences a lot of parts of our lives. In particular, I feel about sexual energy, right? When we have sexual energy, when we are invoking our sexual energy, regardless if we're having sex with somebody else, sex with ourselves, or sex or not having sex, invoking that sexual energy, I believe helps sort of bleed into the rest of our lives with other aspects. So whether it's with work or with school or with family, for me, sex matters because why not? Orgasms feel amazing. Who doesn't want to have an orgasm? Who doesn't want to have a really great orgasm? And granted, some people don't, but like, orgasms feel amazing, and I think everybody should have access to them, and I think everybody should be able to invoke them because it's a really big part of people's lives and connections with other people.
Right, and I think that's the thing about, being able to really connect with other people, either, partners, potentially, ideally, of course, not always, but but also to be in community, to actually be in public spaces and see other people not having sex necessarily, although maybe, but to just be in community where people can talk about it, where the shame dial is turned right down. And that it's not weird and it's not freaky, and more than anything, that folks feel like they're not the only one who's into a thing or not into a thing, or a place where you can go, gosh, I don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
And I feel like everybody knows stuff and I don't know anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why I do education, right? It's one of those things where it's like I want to help people realize more of themselves, to gain more awareness, to ask the questions, ask the deeper questions, to define their sexual values, their sexual desires, their sexual boundaries. So that way, when they get in situations, in relationships or with lovers, that they know themselves and that they know themselves well.
What do you see couples and individuals, even people, what do you see people struggle with the most with sex?
Communication.
Yeah.
Communication. It's very fascinating how I have been working with a couple for a while now, and it's very fascinating to see, like, now we're finally getting to the communication piece. Like, if they just would have known this aspect of communication, right? Like, we talk about in the book, The Ultimate Guide to Seduction and Foreplay, like, I talk about the seduction learning styles. I talk about how to connect to someone on a way that they will understand you better. And so for me, it's super, super important that you understand, because people just say, you just need to communicate, but communication has so many different aspects to it, right? It's dependent upon, it's just way more complicated than just being like, let me ask you a question. It's like, how are you socialized, right? Like, that communication patterns around socialization, how you learn and how you might have to unlearn some communication patterns.
It's way more
thinking about, of course, I talked about the seduction learning styles. What kind of, are you visual, auditory, tactile? What works for you? Thinking about, are you a direct or indirect communicator? Understanding that, knowing that, how to navigate that. Even different words in our vocabulary can really affect how we see things, right? So, and everybody has a different interpretation of things. So I think it's really, really important to be solid and understand, your lover or lovers in a way that feels validating for the both of you.
And it's that skill, I think, when people talk about communication, we often think that communication is talking, and it is talking, but it's so much of it's listening.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because if everybody's talking and nobody's listening, then what's the fucking point?
Right.
So
exactly. Give me the feedback, ask the questions, get deeper. I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding that listening is a huge aspect of communication, and you can't just go into your head and think about what the next thing you're going to say without really engaging and being present in that. So I focus on that in my private work too with folks in relationships. I really try to make sure that they understand and do active listening with each other.
And tell us a little bit more about the book. What was your incentive for writing the book?
Well, I was super, super, ecstatic is probably not even the word to describe how I felt when Dr. Jessica O'Reilly asked me to write the book with her. she was like, we cannot have seduction without Marla. And I just thought, oh, that's really amazing. So I co-authored the book with her, and we set the book up really, the theoretical piece that feels very good and practical and real, and then we have the practical piece of it, and which is my thing, right? Like, theory is great, but theory is not that great unless you don't actually do something and unless you actually practice it.
It needs to be applied.
Yeah, absolutely. And so sometimes, especially as an academician, right, it's like, lots of theories are fun, but nothing really gets applied. So in our book, the theoretical frameworks that are in that are the seduction learning styles, as well as Jess's core erotic feelings and elevated erotic feelings. And so thinking about not only how we communicate, but how do we want to feel when we're having sex? What is it that makes us turn up, right? What are the things that we need to do? And so then after that sort of theoretical part and gaining more awareness, we move into the practical fun stuff, and, put your hand here, put your tongue there, and all those wonderful, lovely things. So I'm really, super, super proud of the book, just because it was very purposeful too, as to make it gender neutral, to ensure that the book is accessible for folks who want to learn more about what their bodies can do. I do workshops on learning the magic of squirting. Did the art of dick teasing workshop yesterday. Go ahead.
I was going to say, they're really sort of practical and useful things you teach in these video workshops.
Huh? Oh yeah, see, have it right here. I was just teaching. So I very, very practical. I have a kissing workshop. I have workshops around kink. So sort of an intro called All About Kink, and then I also have a spank me, slap me, choke me workshop. I have an Art of Dirty Talk workshop. Building up sexual confidence.
Huge suite.
Oh yeah.
Of classes there.
Oh yeah.
Which are the most popular?
Oh, the squirting workshops and the dick teasing workshops. Those are always going to be the most popular. People usually just want to get into it, but my Build Your Sexual Confidence workshop is a pretty good one too. And then I also have a seduction workshop, how to initiate sex, anal workshop, pursuing unicorns, threesomes, and more.
Wow, you really cover the whole field.
Oh yeah. I try to work within my realm and the things that I know, but so those are the things that I really concentrate on.
Yeah. Before, I've got a listener letter for you, Marla, but before we jump into that, I just wanted to ask you one more thing, because, certainly in Australia, there's been a huge groundswell of sex information in the last sort of 10 years, and certainly in the US probably even longer. And people still feel that sex is a taboo, and it's still and there's still so much shame and uncomfortableness attached to it. Why do you think that is?
I think people have been shamed because of the way they've been socialized, the way they've learned. And honestly, especially working in the South, a lot of it comes from religion. I see a lot of people with a lot of religious trauma. A lot of their religion has negatively affected them, to where it's as a child, you're impressionable, right? And so trying to unlearn, it's like trying to unlearn ABCs, right? It's like, okay, how do I unlearn this thing that has been stuck in my head for so long? It's difficult to do. So, I think a lot of that shame and stigma comes from that. I think sometimes in the socialization, around friends being shamed for, being a sexual person or not sexual person. you know, and especially I think now with younger people having access to, I think there's probably less shame with, I would say, Gen Zers, because they've had a lot of sexual information. They have a lot of access to sexual information that previous generations have not had. And so I think that is super important to think about, how shame and stigma might be affecting, you know, affecting maybe me and you, but, you know, shame might not be affecting Gen Zers so much because of the access to information.
Yeah, I've noticed that actually, you know, in my therapy work that I provide, not so much with Gen Z, I haven't had a whole lot to do with them, but I've noticed that people, you know, younger than me, much younger than me, for example, that there has been a bit of a cultural shift. So folks in their 20s are just a lot more chilled out with sex in general, that they're much more comfortable with, you know, the fluidity around being sort of straight or gay or bisexual or pansexual, that seems to be a lot looser than it was, so 20 years ago. But what I'd noticed that they struggle with, which is perhaps the same, is that the communication piece, that you know, being able to be with your feelings and to not freak out when you're having the feels, you know?
Absolutely, and especially because they're getting their social interactions online more so than in person, right? They're getting lots of dopamine hits from the screen rather than dopamine hits from their, you know, best friend that they see every day or whatever. So I think that's also important too, is the cultural shift around the internet and social networks, and how those have really affected the socialization and communication patterns, right?
Yeah. No, I really agree with that. And I think, so this letter that I have for you actually kind of feeds into that theme a little bit. I'll read it to you and you can, well, you know, we'll unpack it together. So are you ready, Marla?
I'm ready.
All right. Dear philosophers, we're a queer couple, one she, her, that's me, and the other they, them. We met 5 years ago and moved in together pretty soon after that, mostly to save money. But it's also nice just to be close. In the beginning, sex between us was great. We're mostly good communicators, but I struggle with sexual confidence because my partner has had a lot more sexual partners than me, and this is also my first queer relationship. Even though I feel loved, I feel sexually inadequate. I've told them about this and they are supportive, but I'm wondering what I can do to upskill my confidence. They tell me that what I do is good, but I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Any advice? There's no name on this one, so the person who wrote in, I hope you're listening. What do you think about that?
I think it's really interesting when people are with other people for the very first time. I think it's always going to be awkward in knowing, but I probably would start asking the questions of what makes you feel inadequate, right? Like, what about the sexual situation makes you feel inadequate, right? Are they not saying anything? Are they not giving feedback during the sexual interaction? What's happening that makes you feel inadequate? Or are they giving the feedback and saying, you know, it says that, oh yeah. You're fine. Why are you feeling insecure? Right? Like, what are the reasons? And so with that, which is actually in the book, is around building sexual confidence. It's really about like retraining and reframing, sort of rewiring your brain to spin those false or those negative things into positives. And so you're rewiring your mind as well as your body. So our bodies often react to certain situations. So I would just probably dive in and see, like, what is your body doing? Well, you know, what makes you feel inadequate? What are the feelings that are coming up that are making you feel this way? But
and so with that idea of you know, of reframing and sort of looking at it through another way, I'm wondering if part of that for her is to, you know, to getting out of her own way a little bit, because she's sort of saying, well, you know, my partner's telling me that everything's fine, But, you know, the story that I'm telling myself is that I'm not good at this, even though, according to this letter anyway, there doesn't appear to be any evidence that she's doing anything wrong, but this overwhelming sense of, I can't seem to shake it. You know, it must be true because I'm feeling it. Can really get in the way of people being able to show up in their relationships, huh?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, because you're absolutely right. Like, it sounds like she's not being present.
Yeah.
Right? Like, she's kind of like here, there, but like actually not surrendering or being vulnerable to the sexual situation. And
so with that sort of surrendering and vulnerability piece, I know that that's really common. Like, even with really advanced, you know, players from the vanilla world through to the kinky world, you know, vulnerability is sort of, you know, vulnerability and sex are a hand in glove, I think, huh? Do you have any kind of go-to techniques or any questions that you invite people to reflect on for when the vulnerability and the surrender is hard to come by?
Yeah, I think erotic breathwork is perfect for that. Perfect because it helps you to sit in your body, be in your body, and take note of what your body is doing. You're practicing your breathing, right? So with erotic breathwork, you know, I have people inhale through their nose, exhale through their mouth, depending on if they're have like a generalized anxiety or is an anxious person or not. If they flex their pelvic floor muscles with that breath work, that really helps to center people and get people in their bodies, recognize like, okay, I'm feeling all of these different feelings. And it makes such a huge difference, even if you're doing it by yourself. Like, even if you're masturbating, breath work is huge because it really helps you to focus and hone into that erotic energy that builds up.
Yeah.
And then always you just kind of have to snap back, right? So sometimes music can help to be present so that your mind is distracted by another thing. I mean, we're all doing that now. We're all like, we gotta watch TV when we're doing our work, or we gotta listen to the book while we're doing work, or whatever the case may be. We have like a bunch of screens on at a time. So I think it's really important that there's something else going on besides just the sexual interaction that can help you focus.
I think that's really important because I think, you know, because so few of us have learned how to manage our feelings, or learned even if we go to workshops and we take classes and we do all this stuff, you know, it's still on us to learn how to integrate this information that we're absorbing. And that, I think, can be the hardest part of learning about sex, is not getting the skills. You know, mostly they're pretty accessible these days, especially with classes like yours online and things like this. But it's integrating it. It's what do we do with the knowledge afterwards? And going back to the beginning of our conversation about, you know, the theory is great and the technique is great, but the proof is in the application. We have to do these things. We have to integrate them and tweak them and make them work for us, rather than trying to be somebody else or do a thing because we saw it in porn. And it's like, well, that's how it has to look, exactly like that. You can make it, you know, that can be your trajectory, but you can do it your own way, because if your body doesn't work like that, or if your mind doesn't work like that,
doesn't look like that. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, especially with my students at the university. It's, you know, I have them watch a documentary called The Perfect Vagina, and it's just like people on this quest who, you know, like, I have to have the vagina, the vulva that looks like the vulva that I see in porn, and it's like, it does not have to look like that. And I think that's super, super important, that we know that bodies come in all these different shapes and sizes, and that not all bodies do the same thing. And I also like to say, the more bodies you come into contact with, the more you learn about different types of bodies and see different types of bodies, and you can, you know, get better at, you know, working out different types of bodies. So,
Marla Renee Stewart, Thank you so much for coming on The Erotic Philosopher. I really, really appreciate you taking time out of your very hectic schedule to come and chat to us. I'm going to put your links in the show notes so people can access you.
Yeah, you can go on my website, thevelvetlipsexed.com. You can find me on social media, Velvet Lips Sex Ed, but sex without the E, or the #1 Marla Stewart. Or if you can just, if you have a question, you can just email me at marla@velvetlipsexed.com.
All of that is going to be super valuable to everybody listening. And once again, I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us.
Thank you. You too. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Hello, listeners. I really hope you enjoyed my discussion with Marla Renee Stewart. Be sure to check out her book and her website, and you can take her online workshops from all over the world. If you're enjoying The Erotic Philosopher, please make sure that you go and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and of course subscribe to get updates every time we release a new episode. You can also follow The Erotic Philosopher on social media. Our handle is @TheEroticPhilos, PHILOS, and we are on Instagram and Twitter. If you have a quandary for the erotic philosophers to ponder, head on over to my website, that's cindydarnell.com, CYNDIDARNELL.com. Select the podcast tab and you'll find the link there to submit your problem. Otherwise, on my website, you can find out ways to work with me, either for counseling or my online pleasure school, to help you solve your own erotic quandaries. Thanks for listening.